On YouTube, somebody asked if I have finished the book Sexual Anorexia, and the question was perfect timing because I did just finish this book a couple of days ago. They were asking what I thought about it overall, and also were specifically asking if it had like religious or spiritual tones to it. I bought this used, I think it was like $5 or $6, including shipping, from one of those like used book sites. Super glad that I bought it, super worth what I paid for it. I have not like taken every word to heart though, which I often do, honestly. Like I take parts of books that apply to me and just kind of skip over the rest and don't worry about it. And I knew going in that I would be doing that with this book because the way that it describes sexual anorexia is not 100% me. It's maybe 40 to 50% me. And I knew that, like, going in. Like, you can look up sexual anorexia on Google and it'll give like a list of traits. And there was some that spoke to me in ways that like no other label had ever described that related to my experience, but there also were a lot of traits on that list that weren't me. And so I knew I'm not like a true sexual anorexic, but I also knew that this concept was closer to my experience than any other term I had come across, and so I was still excited to take what I could get out of this book. Once I got into the book and realized that they talk about sexual anorexia being on a spectrum with sexual addiction on the other end and sexual bulimia in the middle, for a split second I was like, maybe that's why, maybe I'm sexually bulimic and that's why I'm like half anorexic. But that isn't true for me either. I'm like closer to the anorexic end of the spectrum, but basically for me it's like it's not that I completely severed my sexuality the way that sexual anorexics will. It's more like my sexuality split between like psychological and physical. I have to stay in my head. It's hard for me to get into my body and like be embodied during sex. Like my body detects that as a threat. Whereas, so that's like a huge loophole for me that allows me to be intimate and just, I'm not really a sexual anorexic. However, there are a lot of aspects to like the anxiety and stuff that comes with sexual anorexia, and the shame and kind of like prudish behaviors, I guess, for lack of a better term, that I definitely relate to. And so even though it's maybe half me, maybe not even half me, it was a kind of a relief and a somewhat healing thing to just find my experience explained somewhat. A fairly big part of the book, it references people who are on the like sexual dysfunction spectrum potentially being good candidates to go to Recovering Couples Anonymous, which is a 12-step program along the lines of AA or NA or that kind of a thing. And I have mixed feelings about that. I'm not a therapist. I haven't done tons of research into addiction. I've never like had substance issues or whatever. But I follow a ton of therapists on TikTok, and I know that a lot of the therapists that I really respect are kind of anti-AA. That the kind of idea of like stopping fully, like an abstinence-based mindset with alcoholism and other substances, and also just kind of this idea of seeing it as a disease and telling you that you're helpless and that you need a higher power. That, not that it doesn't work for anybody, it does work for some people, but it is like less than 10%, I think, success rate. And that for people it doesn't work for, it can actually cause them additional trauma or additional issues. For example, I believe that after a period of abstinence, a big part of the problem is like if people do relapse, they tend to relapse worse than they would have if they had just never quit. And I think it's because this kind of like black and white thinking of we have to have total abstinence can make people think once they fall off the wagon, then they're like back in this bad category and they're like totally helpless now, and it just can really add to the shame. The other thing is AA is like over 100 years old now, and it hasn't really updated much. And we have learned so much about trauma in the last 100 years, even in the last 50 years. And there's so much correlation with addictions and trauma that it really doesn't make sense that like the biggest groups, the biggest like programs for addiction recovery aren't trauma informed. So anyway, I generally, although I don't know a ton about it, my gut feeling from what little I have researched is I'm not super key on 12 step, and so this referencing the idea of 12 steps is a little iffy. However, something that I think is really cool about this is it does reference how like a black and white mindset with this is really harmful, because that's kind of what the spectrum is. It's sexual addiction is compulsive sexuality, like compulsively seeking sex, or sexual pleasure, and on the other end it's compulsively avoiding sex. And so it outright talks about how like either extreme is bad and the goal is to find balance, and also to just kind of like relieve the anxiety that is driving the compulsion. And so I think in that way it is a lot better than like say AA, which is very black and white thinking, like you need to never have a sip of alcohol again. There are bits of this book that are spiritual or religious. There's a small section that is called spirituality. I'm an atheist, so I like barely even skimmed that, but I did see that it is talking about we shouldn't feel like sexuality and spirituality are opposites, or suggests that your sexual self, when you are in like a healthy and vulnerable and like truly emotionally intimate sexual relationship with somebody, should actually be somewhat spiritual, because your spiritual self should be your most true self and your sexual self is your true self. Also, it does reference LGBT, I guess not so much like gender queer, but it talks about being gay or being bi, and how that can contribute to sexual issues just because of the lack of acceptance in society, not because of anything inherent. But yeah, it seems pretty like gay and bi friendly. And it does have some like exercises or practices that it encourages for healing. And they kind of overlap a fair amount with things that I have heard from my therapist, things I've heard from other sources, things like working on being embodied and working on just really, really listening to your body and really having great communication and being really, really clear with boundaries and exactly what you do and don't like and so on. So I think it's pretty good overall. I just wouldn't say it's like the perfect book that'll solve all your problems, but I don't think any book is like that.